Alright, so here we are in exercise 13 and we're working with patterns. So patterns can be created in a lot of different ways, and what we're going to go over is the pattern tile types. So we're going to see that there's three main tile types for patterns, and then we're going to actually get into making our own custom patterns. All of the patterns that we create and save and bring up is going to be done through the swatches panel. So let's make sure to have the swatches panel open. I'll go ahead and pull that out. And before we actually start to dive into making patterns, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that we have actually a large library of patterns to choose from here in Illustrator. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this rectangular shape here and just browse through some different patterns in the pattern library. So I'll click the library icon and go to patterns, and let's just find basic graphics, and let's try textures. So it pulls it up in a separate window. I'm going to go ahead and click the options icon and go to large thumbnail view, and I'll start toggling through some of these basic pattern textures. So we can see that these are line based, line and stipples. So if you want to have more personality to an area and you want a regular repeating texture, this is a good way to go. Alright, so let's look at some other ones. I'll go to patterns. This time I'll go to decorative and see if you guys have the decorative legacy. And so these ones are more geometric, and they're almost like tessellations. So if any of you know M.C. Escher, the famous artist that did tessellations, they were kind of like these interwoven patterns and abstract objects. So that's where you're going to find that kind of pattern work is in the decorative legacy. So something like this is like a tessellation. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and go back to patterns, and this time I'll go to nature, and I'll go ahead and choose animal skins. And these have some pretty cool ones. This is alligator skin, cheetah, elephant, giraffe, peacock, snake. So all kinds of cool and novel things. So if you notice, every time I was clicking on one of those patterns, it was adding it to my swatches panel. So that means at the end of the day, I could save this group of patterns and bring them up regularly for a project that I'm working on. So go ahead and just find a pattern that you like and just fill in that shape. For me, I'm going to use that turtle pattern. I'll go ahead and close that window. Coming down here, let's talk a little bit more about the pattern tile types. So there's three main types of tiles. There's a square tile, so that means the dimensions are the same on the width and the height. There's rectangular tiles, and then there's hexagonal tiles. If you make a pattern, so say I'm making a tile and I want to repeat those tiles over and over again, what I need to look at is that the top will repeat on the bottom and vice versa. The bottom will repeat on the top. The same way that anything that happens on the left or that bleeds out of the left is going to repeat on the right. So just kind of keep that in mind when you go about creating your own patterns, is that things that come off of the tile need to repeat on the opposite side. The most complex form of this is this hexagonal or honeycomb pattern. So let's play around with this concept. I've made these three pattern swatches, and you could just have easily made these two. These are just simple shapes, and I took a simple square shape and I used the shape builder to delete all the other edges, and so all I'm left with is this group of shapes. So to create a pattern, it's as easy as taking this group of shapes and then dragging it into the swatches panel. Now that that group of shapes is in the swatches panel, it automatically recognizes it as a pattern. So if I were to click on this rectangle right below and then click on the new pattern swatch, it starts to fill that in. Starts to tile that. So how do we further modify this pattern once we've created it? Well, it's as simple as coming over to the swatches panel and then double clicking on your pattern. And this is where we get our pattern options. So this is the pattern options panel. Right here we see a pattern preview, and we can see that there's some little gaps that we might need to fix in here, but I'm just going to go ahead and name this. I'll name it my name, and then here's where I can change the tile type. So right over here, I could do it just a standard grid, which is the most common. I could stagger the grid brick by row, and then you can change the amount of staggering. So right now it's staggering it by 1/2. I could change this to 1/4 or 1/3 or 4/5. I could come in here and arrange these by column. So now it's staggering it in the vertical direction. And then I could come over here to hex by column. Now it's a little confusing since the swatch is a square, so it doesn't really know how to reform that square into a hexagon. So we'll come back to that one. For now, I'm just going to keep it as a grid. And then here I could set the width and height of this individual container. So right now I'm at 1.4 inches. I'll just change this to 1.2 and we can see that the proportions are not linked. So I'll just hit enter. And now you can see it's changing the tile that's repeating. I'll go ahead and change the other one to 1.2. I'll hit enter. We could click on this one, size tile to art. So as I size that tile, I can also change the size of my art. I'm going to go ahead and uncheck that, and I'll just keep this at 1.4 by 1.4. Right down here, this is called the overlap, and by default, it puts your overlap on your left and your top. So that means the left side is the side that's allowed to go over this, and then the top side is allowed to go over the tile. We could switch that. We could change it to the right side and the bottom side are the overlapping sides. We can also preview the number of copies. So right now it's doing a 5x5 grid for us. We could make this larger, but I like to keep this small because it gives you a pretty good indication of what this pattern is going to look like. So I like this view because you can zoom in. So I'm just doing command and plus sign. And I'll actually hit V for my black arrow. And if I wanted to, I could come in here and I could individually move these separate shapes. So I could edit this in real time. If I zoom out, I can see some of the errors that need to be fixed. So I just fixed the error of having a gap in between this circle. So that looks like it's been fixed, although the placement of the circle could be adjusted. So I'll zoom in really close and I'll use my black arrow and kind of scoot this down. So I'm looking here and here, just making sure that overlaps, and I'm trying to get that line to kind of meet up on that side. So that looks like it's good. If I zoom out and I look over here in the preview, that looks pretty good. And then there was a line right here, but I think that was fixed. So now it's a pretty seamless pattern. One more thing to pay attention to is this tool right here. It's called the Pattern Tile tool. If I click on that, what this is going to allow me to do is resize the tile. So the tile is essentially the preview of how to repeat this pattern. So anything within this window is what gets repeated. So you can see I offset that tile a little bit, and so hence it changed the pattern. I'll do Command Z and I'll come over here, and this time I'll squash it down into like a rectangle. Now we can see that that top side is kind of gone up and overlapped, and then we're left with that part of the tile. So this just takes practice and experience working with this tile tool in order to really master and understand it. Okay, so when I'm all done using the pattern options, just like isolation mode, I can hit escape, or I can come over here and go to exit pattern editing mode. And then I'll zoom out, and there we go. So we successfully turned a swatch into a pattern. All right, so let's try it with this one. So I'll click on that and I'll drag it into the swatches panel. Then I'll go ahead and click on this new shape and I'll apply the pattern, and it looks like it's doing a pretty good job. I'll double click to get my pattern options. So even though we don't see any options for a rectangular swatch, you can see it recognizes that. I'll zoom in a little bit, so I'll just go ahead and check that. You can see it's a little off right there. So I'm going to go ahead and see if I can change that. So I'll click on this star and move that down just a little bit. And this time I'll use my white arrow so I can select individual parts. So I can see I have an unwanted gap right here. Let's see if we can change that. So I'll select that edge with the white arrow and then move it up. Well, let's see if we can kind of fix this transition right here. There we go. And now that that is in place, let's see if we can move this star. I'll use the white arrow. And now I'm just using the arrow keys. I'll hit V for the black arrow to isolate that, and I'll size this down a little bit. I'm holding down on the shift key in order to size it proportionally. Zoom in a little bit more. I'm just looking at these edges right here, trying to get more of a seamless transition. All right, I'll zoom out, and that looks pretty good. I can see there were some issues here in creating this star, but it ends up looking pretty good for the whole pattern. All right, I'll hit escape and zoom out. When we go over the manual patterns, we'll try to get a better way of solving this. All right, let's try one more tile type. Let's try this one. Okay, so this is our hexagonal pattern. I'll throw this into the swatches panel. Okay, I'll click outside and then click this rectangle and fill it. All right, and it's tiling it by default just like a grid. So I'll double click on the new pattern, and this time I'll say hex by column. There we go, and we got that to tile pretty well. And everything else I'm just going to leave because it looks pretty good. I'll hit escape. Okay, so let's come down over here and let's discuss doing what's called a manual pattern. So a manual pattern is basically taking a group of objects, and maybe you haven't worked out all of the details of how these are going to tile together, but you have a good idea of what you want for this pattern. And you can see that I just have this background color to kind of just start with something, have some kind of background on this pattern, and that's what we're going to use. So I'll go ahead and do a marquee selection of all those objects. I'll drag it into the swatches panel. You can see it gives me a little preview. I'll select this square here and fill it with that pattern, and you can see it's trying its best to move those around. But now I'll double click and I'll start using my pattern options to kind of pull this into place. So I'll zoom in, and maybe I will start by expanding the background. So I'm just pulling this to the extent of the tile, and I'm looking right here, so it looks like it's my, I'll zoom in a little bit, and I'm going to make sure I have my smart guides on, so it helps me snap to those points. And you know what I can see right here? I have a stroke on this blue rectangle. I'll go ahead and take off that stroke, and wow, what a difference. Okay, so I'll keep pulling that into place, and I'm trying to get rid of the gap. All right, that looks like it works. All right, so let's make this more interesting. So I know that it's my left side and my top side that are going to be the overlap. And I can see that I actually need to flip. I need to change top in front to this one, bottom in front. And now I can have this shape start to come up and bleed into the next tile. I'll go ahead and do that. All right, and let's try this red circle. I'm gonna make it bigger, and then I'll switch the overlap, and there, now I can have that bleed into the next tile. Zoom out a little bit, see how it's going. And let's see what happens when I pull this triangle over here. Okay. And then I'll actually start to rotate this, get something like this, a little more interesting. All right, and I'll make the green one bigger, and I'll move that a little bit. Maybe I'll make this smaller. I'll zoom out, see how that's looking. Yeah, it looks pretty interesting. All right, so I'll exit that. That's a pretty basic manual pattern. Let's try this complex set of shapes here. So I'm going to go ahead and select those shapes, and I'll just make sure to deselect the rectangle behind it. You guys might not have this in your exercise, so I just want this group of shapes, and I'll pull it into the swatches panel. Okay. An important thing is you need to make sure to click off of those shapes, otherwise you will try to fill in a pattern in all these shapes and it just turns into a nightmare. Okay, so now I'll select this object here, this square, and I'll apply the pattern. Okay, and now I'll double click here, and I'll start by adjusting the tile. So I'll pull this around, and let's choose to offset it. Let's do a brick by column, and now I'm going to pull some parts of the tile in. Ooh, so I like this, but there's some parts here we need to fix. So I'm bricking by column. It's a brick offset of 1/2, but right here we're getting some issues. So I'm going to come in, and I'm going to use my white arrow. I'll select this shape, and for this I'm going to start to reform this shape. Command Z if you happen to start editing more of the shape than you wanted. I'm going to start pulling this up in here. I'll size that part down, and let's see how far we can go getting this to come up here. Looks pretty interesting. See if we can come all the way up here and wrap this around. So this is good practice using some of these control handles. Alright, so I like that. And now that that is complete, maybe I'll modify this part a little bit more. I'll pull this part down, and I'll make these control handles a little bit longer. There, so it looks like it's following the contours. I'll zoom out a little bit and see how this is going. Yeah, this is a very intricate pattern right now, and I think I'll take this circle and just copy it. So I'll hold down on the Alt key, copy that right there, and then I'll make that just a little bit bigger. All right, pretty cool. We moved this one all the way up here, moved this one down, and we just added a little bit more to those circles. Maybe I'll make this one a little bit bigger. All right, so when I like what I have, I'll hit escape. I'll hit the V key and then zoom out, and that's pretty interesting. Almost looks like an elephant. All right, so now it's your turn. I want you to take some time to just draw up some objects and shapes into a tile. You can go ahead and try just a regular square tile tile, a rectangle, or you can try a hexagon. Just make sure it has 4 objects, and I'm looking for 2 objects that overlap into the next tile. So see what you can come up with, and that does it for the overview of working with patterns in Illustrator.